This is from Joel Hirschhorn, which we read at the last meeting. Most corrupt and legally sanctioned forms of tyranny hide in plain sight as democracies with free elections. The toughest lesson is that all elections are distractions. Nothing conceals tyranny better than elections. Few Americans accept that their government has become a two-party plutocracy run by a rich and powerful ruling class. The steady erosion of the rule of law is masked by everyday consumer freedoms. Because people want to be happy and hopeful, we have an epidemic of denial, especially in the present presidential campaign. But to believe that any change-selling politician or shift in any party control will overturn the ruling class is the epitome of self-delusion and false hope. In the end, such wishful thinking perpetuates plutocracy. Proof is the plutocracy has flourished despite the repeated changes of governments. And I think that really portrays what's going on now. I was surprised today that the nation backed Obama, which is maybe not so surprising. But to introduce Sander, we have a professor from Pacific University, Jules Boykoff. He's the author of Beyond Bullets, The Suppression of Dissent in the U.S., also How the State and Mass Media Squelch U.S. American Social Movements, why isn't that the truth, and also Landscape of Dissent, Guerrilla Poetry, and Public Space. He has written for popular publications like Common Dreams, The Argonian, and NACLA, Report on the Americas, as well as academic journals like Social Movement Studies, Journal of Politics, and New Political Science. So to introduce Sander, here's Professor Jules Boykoff.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all out there. I'm very pleased that Sander Hicks is joining us tonight. Sander Hicks is a media activist, writer, and indefatigable agitator. He comes to us from Brooklyn, New York, where he runs the coffee house called Vox Pop, a community-empowering, consciousness-raising space that's galvanized numerous activist groups and published a muckraking tabloid called the New York Megaphone, which he has back there, I can see. Hicks has a fascinating and varied background. He's worked as a playwright, a carpenter, and as a customer service manager on Wall Street. In 1996, he founded Soft Skull Press, which is under different ownership now, but a really important, vibrant, small press that's put out a number of great books. He's done reporting for Alternet, GNN, the New York Press, Free Speech TV, Dish Network. In 2006, he was a U.S. Senate candidate for the Green Party. His book, The Big Wedding, zeroes in on intelligence assets and whistleblowers who tried to stop 9/11 from happening. Tonight, he'll speak about FBI malfeasance using numerous examples from U.S. history. In particular, he'll be zeroing in at one point on the case of Dr. David Graham. In order to fully comprehend what Sander Hicks is going to talk about tonight, I think it helps to understand the wider context of the state's suppression of dissent, which is why I guess was asked to introduce him. So a great place to start with that really is the COINTELPRO, counterintelligence programs, which spanned from 1956 through 1971. They were preceded actually by another acronym called COMINFIL, Communist Infiltration Investigations. But COINTELPRO, which really later became infamous because they were found out, they ran from 1956 to 71, 5 branches, including one branch against the Communist Party USA, one against the Socialist Workers' Party, one against white hate groups, another against the New Left, and a 5th against what they call black nationalist hate groups, which, incidentally, included Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, even though it was called black nationalist hate groups, and even though Dr. King and his group preached love, not hate. In any case, it's interesting, I think, to take note of why COINTELPRO stopped, at least nominally, in 1971. And that was because on the 8th of March, 1971, there was a group that dubbed itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI that broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and made off with reams of internal FBI documents. subsequently released those to a number of politicians, which wouldn't touch them, but also gave them to the press, which did touch them, published many of them, and that's how we came to know about COINTELPRO. So I think it's interesting to have that be a leaping off point as well, because COINTELPRO is very dreary, but that act of courage is not so dreary. In fact, is quite inspiring. Now, just because COINTELPRO ended in 1971 doesn't mean that the tactics used within COINTELPRO are done, and that's one of the things Sanders is going to touch on tonight, is many of the tactics that still exist today. Today, I think we need vigilance and we need courage, not unlike the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. And one person who's been both vigilant and courageous is Sander Hicks. So please join me in welcoming him to Portland, Oregon.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be back here in Portland. I haven't been here for like 15 years, but Portland, Oregon, boy, it was the first town on the West Coast I ever visited. In the summer of 1990, I took a bus from Washington, D.C., all the way out here. It took 3 days, but I lived here for a little bit of that summer. And Jules, thank you so much for that intro. That was really great. That's the best intro of the tour thus far. And what he didn't have in hand, I often have in hand during my speaking tour, and that's a copy of Dr. Boykoff's Beyond Bullets, The Suppression of Dissent in the United States. And I'll be talking more about his book and how it's part of my talk. Before I talk, I sometimes forget to mention I do have an email list, so if anybody wants free journalism from somebody who some people call one of the best alternative journalists in the USA, at least my new friends in Hollywood, that's their new tagline. I personally don't think like, well, anyway, it's an okay tagline. Here, you want a pen? In the spirit of a Quaker meeting hall, I'd like us to just start off with a moment of silence. The Quakers have this tradition of not having a hierarchy, but instead having a respect for the inner light that's inside all of us. So let's just, if you feel like closing your eyes, you can close your eyes, but let's do a moment of silence together and kind of make a break between the work day and our night together, okay? We'll come back to this moment. We'll end here in the same way that we began tonight. What I'm going to do is take you through a tour of some of the darkest points of American politics. But we're not going to end in the darkness. We're going to end with new courage and new hope. I'm going to share with you my vision of what I'm doing, and we're going to come together on a vision of the way the world will be, could be, should be, rather than the details of where we're at right now. Because my people, my friends, my brothers and sisters, for the first time in the history of our truth movement, our peace movement, for the first time in the history of 9/11 truth, an activist has died. And all the criteria of a murder investigation point to the FBI being the main suspect. I feel very close to this case. I just was down in Shreveport, Louisiana, investigating it myself, just this past September and October. And I learned a lot about this guy. His name was Dr. David Graham. And he was a Christian, in a real roots Christian kind of way. For instance, when a homeless guy moved into the trailer on the guy's property, he didn't call the cops. He went out there with like food and conversation and spare change of clothes, got that guy back on his feet. He was an entrepreneur. He was a radio journalist. He had his own radio show. He was taking on local Shreveport corruption for the last 15 years, and intermittently was doing independent media. And if you know anything about Shreveport, Louisiana, you don't really have to scratch the surface too deeply to find some serious government corruption. For instance, 15 years ago or so, Dr. Graham was involved in the Mons case. The Mons case was the local DA dealing narcotics, framing a local Air Force guy for a murder having to do with blackmail and bribery. So that's how Dr. Graham met a few of his friends. Got involved in the Shreveport Community Church with a guy named John Milkovich. John Milkovich is a very interesting Shreveport character. He's a lawyer. He's a former Democratic congressional candidate. And John Milkovich helped him with the Mons case, and they worked together up to the point where Milkovich gave Graham's eulogy at Graham's funeral a year ago from last September. Graham, like I said, was an entrepreneur. He was a dentist by trade, but he also had a natural toothpaste. He was trying to, do the American dream. And so at one point he met a very slick guy who seemed to come from money, a guy named Muhammad Jamal Khan. Now Khan's a very visual character. I brought back some video that's on, YouTube and Google Video. You can see him. He's a blonde Pakistani. It's pretty rare because he was a sort of an albino. But he was very slick, and he was born in Saudi Arabia, raised in Pakistan. He bragged about family connections to Washington, D.C., political connections. He bragged about his family back in Pakistan having factories and farms. So Graham thinks maybe he can get an investor in his natural toothpaste company. And they have a couple of meetings. Khan never wants to meet in Shreveport in public. He always wants to meet in his own townhouse. And at one point, Graham overhears Khan bragging about a family connection to Osama bin Laden. This is the fall of year 2000. Osama bin Laden is not yet, the scapegoat for 9/11, but he is something of a household name after the African embassy bombings, right? So that's the first red flag that goes off for Graham. Then at one point, Khan introduces Graham in his townhouse to a couple of young medical students. Supposedly they're Saudi doctors, young Saudis studying medicine in the USA. However, something doesn't quite connect for Graham because the young medical students, the young Saudi doctors, don't speak English. So how could you be in Shreveport in the Bible Belt studying medicine when you don't speak English? It's another red flag that goes off. Graham makes notes at one point. He's in Khan's kitchen. He sees 3 cardboard boxes on the ground underneath the kitchen table. He sees 3 Arabic names. And he writes these names down and reports them to the FBI. The names are worth noting. And I'm going to try to not overwhelm you with too much Arabic jargon, but let's remember these names together. Nawaf al-Hazmi, Fayed bin Ahmad, and Khalid Almidar. He reports these names to the FBI. The FBI, instead of investigating and getting back to him, calls him up and says, yeah, Dr. Graham, we got a strange phone call here at Shreveport HQ. They say that they're going to get whoever ratted out Muhammad Jamal Khan. So this is the top policing organization of our fine country, right? And for some reason they can't trace that call. They have to pass along some sort of death threat that they just got, supposedly. 9/11 happens. Less than 4 weeks later, Newsweek publishes a whole full-color, expose, right? The 19 faces, the 19 hijackers. Graham is aghast to see the names and faces. 2 of them he actually met, the young Saudi medical students or young Saudi doctors, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Fayed bin Ahmad. Graham is aghast to see that Khalid Almidar, the 3rd name on the cardboard box, was also supposedly a hijacker, according to this big official story, and that Osama bin Laden is supposedly, the head of the attack the spiritual leader of the attackers. So Graham starts documenting everything that has happened up to this point with a scientific vigor. You know, his investigative journalist background, taking on Shreveport corruption, kicks in. His background as a trained dentist, his flair for forensics kicks in, and he creates a document called the 9/11 Graham Report that has excruciating detail of everything that he was thinking and feeling and seeing and recording. And he travels to Washington, D.C. on his own dime, tries to get a meeting with, higher ups at the House Senate Joint Inquiry. That doesn't really go anywhere. He plans to publish the book, and the FBI is urging him not to publish that book. He's got an independent, vanity press deal lined up in Shreveport, a small independent printer publisher. And according to a close friend of Graham's that I met down in New Orleans, the FBI was adamant that he shouldn't publish the book. So, May the 29th, 2004, Graham is on the road in Texas, not far from Shreveport, but somewhere in between Lake Conroe, just north of Houston, and Diboll, Texas, sometime between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., Dr. David M. Graham is poisoned with a lethal dose of ethylene glycol, which is a toxin that's found in antifreeze. We think it was found it was ingested in an iced tea bottle that he had in his car at the time. He pulled over, thought he had a heart condition, went to the emergency room in Diboll, Texas. A friend of his comes from Shreveport, tells them to do a toxicology report that there might be foul play here, and that toxicology report comes back positive. They put a security guard at the door of his emergency room quarters. However, FBI shows up at that hospital. FBI starts telling the doctors, did you know this guy's crazy? Did you know this guy's suicidal? Why would you work so hard to try to save the life of somebody who just tried to kill themselves? The cardiac surgeon leaves the case and stops administering to Dr. Graham because of this FBI statement at the time. Back in Shreveport, FBI tells the local TV station, we were not involved, and we don't know if this was suicide or not. Meanwhile, the friends and family around Graham are aghast that the FBI is inferring to the media or implying to the media that he could have been suicidal. They point out that Graham was en route to a wedding, a joyous occasion, a big event in their circle. To this day, none of the friends and none of the family believe that he could have been suicidal. And it's important to keep that in mind. Now, I've learned a lot about that guy, Muhammad Jamal Khan. And before we leave the Dr. Graham case and zoom back and look at the big picture, I want to share some extra details. It is indubitable that Graham did in fact meet with 9/11 hijackers. If you go on Collateral News online, you can see the actual video that I brought back and shared with my friends in 9/11 Truth and at Collateral News. Because Graham was so cagey, a year before he was poisoned, in 2003, Khan was in and out of prison in Shreveport for wire transfer charges, weapons charges. Graham got Khan to come into his office where he had a hidden video camera, and he taped Khan. They're talking about Khan's connections in Washington, and then Dr. Graham very ingenuously says, hey, whatever happened to those young doctors? You know, whatever happened to those guys? Faye had kind of a girl's name, Faye, Fayed, something like that. And Khan takes the bait, and Khan says, oh, those Muslims, I don't have anything to do with those Muslims. I'm a Christian now. It's a very poor mentality. No, those people is gone. What happened? September 11th happened. Those people is gone. So Khan confirms the Graham goes through the dates and the times. Do you remember this meeting and that meeting? And Khan confirms that, and then confirms that those people is gone in his broken English. Also, I dug up a court record in a plea agreement when Khan pled out of wire transfer sentencing. There's actually a very interesting paragraph that stands out. You know, the details, the legalistics of, like, you know, we're going to take this agreement on the wire transfer charges. But then this paragraph pops up and it says, however, this plea agreement in no way precludes the prosecution from ever in the future prosecuting the defendant, Mohammed Jamal Khan, from crimes related to the September 11th attacks. And then it says, oh, the prosecution at this time is not, you know, interested in prosecuting Khan for those crimes, or we have no knowledge of those crimes at this point. But if they had no knowledge of those crimes, why do they include that paragraph? It's an anomaly. And that is itself a smoking gun that this guy, Khan, had a relationship to the 9/11 hijackers, or patsies, if you will, because that's what we're really talking about here. Let's use the term Lee Harvey Oswald used when he, in one of his few public statements, he said, I am a patsy. That's the real story here. Now, in 9/11 Truth, we have a very interesting grassroots movement. It's really a starfish in the sense of, there's this new book, Starfish and the Spider, and it talks about the power of decentralized movements versus hierarchies. And hierarchies are like spiders. If you knock off the head or you kill the leader, the spider usually dies. But a starfish, like the Apache Indians, they could never be conquered by the Spanish because they didn't have a head. They had cultural leaders at the, you know, village level called non-tans. But so in the same way, 9/11 Truth doesn't have a president. We don't really have that much of a hierarchy. We have these decentralized pockets. It's really all about sharing, free DVDs, sharing books, sharing information, getting together. It's about community. It's about trying to reclaim democracy. So it's a really interesting movement. And I'm here to just have us reflect for a moment that we, you know, just remember 2002, remember 2003, remember the hysteria, the pro-war hysteria, the frenzy of, like, even our moderate friends, our liberal friends, were whipped up into, like, thinking, well, we got to get them, we got to do something, right? But now, even moderate Republican people, according to actual polls, you know, scientific, New York Times, Scripps Howard polls, we're seeing a shift in public opinion, that more and more people, almost a majority, reject the official story, and that a full majority has questions about the official story. And if you want me to prove that even further, look at the train wreck of Rudy Giuliani's campaign. This guy put all of his chips on this 9/11 nationalism issue. He put all of his chips on Florida, thinking that that would be the most patriotic, pro-war state. And he utterly lost. He came up utterly politically bankrupt. And it's a beautiful thing. Because it really shows. Thank you, yeah. It shows something. In the same way, when Mitt Romney pulled out of the race, he pulled out of the race in this sort of psychobabble about the war on terror. It was really unclear what he was thinking, but he was trying to invoke the war on terror, and his point was unclear. But it was clear that he was trying to invoke the war on terror to justify, obviously, a sudden move for him that was obviously the source of some trauma for him. But so, 9/11 Truth is powerful. However, part of my message is that there are certain trends inside the 9/11 Truth movement. And we go through, you know, certain points of view are more in fashion than others at certain times. For instance, I find that in the past couple of years, controlled demolition has been really at the forefront of the way a lot of people are talking about, you know, a point of entry into 9/11 Truth. And it's obviously worked. You know, those videos are compelling online, especially World Trade Center 7. However, I'm not an architect or an engineer, so I don't focus on controlled demolition. And so I'm here to say that the Dr. Graham death, you know, the creation of really the first martyr of 9/11 Truth, is an opportunity to step back and assess the entire issue, not even 9/11 Truth as an issue, but the entire peace movement issue, you know, the entire issue of war and peace and the reassertion of democracy. And so instead of controlled demolition as being the point of entry for skeptics into the 9/11 truth movement, I'm here to suggest this. Let's pretend I had a gigantic magic marker. I want to write on a dry erase board. There is a pattern of U.S. federal protection of those 9/11 patsies. And the Dr. Graham death is obviously the most visceral, violent example of that, but it's not the only example. And I feel that even more compelling than the controlled demolition argument is an argument based on hard historical fact, some of which are corroborated by very mainstream sources. Some of them you have to dig a little bit more. But there's like about 5 or 6 major points that I need to make at this point. It's kind of like a timeline, but they back up the pattern of federal protection over the 9/11 hijackers, like a shield, like a gigantic eagle covering up these little, what's a baby eagle? Gosling or something. Eaglets, there you go, good. That was obviously a new metaphor for me. It's different every night. But let me take you through a quick timeline. Even according to the 9/11 Commission report, in Malaysia in early 2000, our guys, again, it's the same names, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar, the 9/11 ringleaders, the right-hand men of Osama bin Laden, the guys that were so zealous for the attack they got their visas early. Well, these guys, we know they were in Malaysia. And we know that our CIA knew they were in Malaysia, and our CIA was on them like white on rice. Our CIA had the room bugged, photo surveillance. It was a joint venture with Filipino intelligence. And yet, for some reason, according to the incompetence excuse, for some reason, those guys, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar, were not put on the terrorism watch list until about a year and a half later, and I'll get to that. Then, September 2000, they fly into LAX. They are met by emissaries of the Saudi embassy and are taken care of by being installed down in San Diego with a landlord who happens to be a longtime FBI informant. His name is Abdul Sadr Sheikh. But since I've been told to kind of keep the Arabic names to a minimum so you're not confused, we'll call him the San Diego informant. Now, let me flesh out just how important that San Diego informant was/is. And again, according to a very mainstream, conflicted, problematic, but very mainstream source, Senator Bob Graham, no relation to the late, great Dr. David Graham, but Senator Bob Graham is so very interested when he's heading up and being a big part of the joint Senate-House inquiry into the 9/11 attacks, that Senator Bob Graham asks, and then asks again, the FBI to produce the San Diego informant who lived with the terrorist ringleaders. Boy, is that an anomaly. Boy, wouldn't you love to be the head of Senate Foreign Intelligence, because you would think you could get the FBI to do what you want, right? Well, not in this case, folks, because he continually asks, and then as he talks about in his book, Intelligence Matters, he says, I was forced to create a subpoena. It was going to be the first time that a U.S. senator had to subpoena an FBI agent to get them to produce. So he talks about the subpoena being in his inside jacket pocket. He's got the FBI cornered in his office, and they're giving him the same old BS runaround. And he produces the subpoena, and the FBI guy is just like, it's like kryptonite. And literally, as he talks about in the book, FBI goes up against the wall and like kind of slithers out of the office without touching the subpoena. Because as you probably know from TV, if you touch the subpoena, you're served, and that means you have to show up in court, right? In FBI, in Miami Vice, they throw the subpoena at you, and if it hits you in the chest. Well, in this case, the FBI guy obviously knew that, and so he didn't want to be the historical first FBI agent to get served a subpoena. This is how intense the cover-up was over that San Diego informant. We know now from 9/11 Blogger, they found some FBI documents that prove that right after that incident, Abdul Sadr Sheikh, the San Diego informant, was paid off. He was given $100K. Not in 2002 when Senator Bob Graham wanted him, but after he was successfully hidden from our own Senate Foreign Intelligence investigation. So, back to the timeline. August 2001, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar are in the sights of an Israeli intelligence operation, Mossad. They've got about 120 undercover art students in Florida tracking terrorists. One of them that they're also tracking is Mohammed Atta. I mentioned this in my book. However, CIA is also there. And the CIA intervenes when they feel that Mossad is getting too close to interfering with the 9/11 hijackers. And the CIA preemptively deports all 120 Israeli spies. The Mossad responds by flipping the CIA the bird by publishing a list, an extensive list of about 19 or 20 hijackers planning an attack in the US, and the hijackers are already in the US, and so the CIA is embarrassed. And at that point, does the CIA put the names Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar on the terrorism watch list? A couple years ago, congressional testimony came out. It was kind of a subcommittee, low level, didn't make the mainstream media. But Representative Kurt Weldon, kind of a maverick from Pennsylvania, held testimony around the Able Danger operation. Show of hands, who's heard of Able Danger? Okay, good. That's good. But for those of you who've never heard of it, this is another big smoking gun, and it's a huge part of this pattern of federal protection over the patsies. Because Able Danger was the US military's best and brightest. You know, this was the Defense Intelligence Agency, and these guys were, fired up to find Al-Qaeda. In early 2000, they did open source intelligence and data mining, and they used all these, mathematical programs and the internet and all these sources of data, and they found Al-Qaeda was already in the US. And then they show up at a meeting with their superiors with a big chart with faces and names, and for some reason when they show up, their superiors had put yellow sticky notes, Post-its, over the faces and names of certain Al-Qaeda operatives. And can you guess which faces and names were covered up?
Mohammed Atta.
Very good. And can you name two more?
No.
Well, I'll give you a hint. Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar. Very good, very good.
I can't pronounce it.
I know. It's people have that problem, but we got to learn a little bit of Arabic. If I say assalamu alaikum, you say? Very good, very good, excellent. We're not in small town California anymore. Finally, I got to say that I'm friends with Joe Trento. He wrote Secret History of the CIA. He wrote a great book called Prelude to Terror, and he did a new book called Unsafe at Any Altitude. And it's a book about aviation safety, and it's kind of like a very careful book, because I was really expecting a 9/11 book at this time. But instead, he wrote this book about aviation safety, but he slipped in a little nugget of information, like in the middle of the book. Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar, says Trento, were agents of the Saudi GID. Now, I was like, what are your sources? He was like, my sources are inside Western and Saudi intelligence. And this guy's really the top of the game. This guy was close to CIA muckety-muck, Jesus Angleton, the basis of Good Shepherd, the movie. So I really believe Trento, and it really helps explain just how much Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar were protected. So let's remember, they were protected by CIA in Malaysia of 2000. They were protected by FBI in Shreveport and in San Diego. They were protected by CIA from Mossad in August, and they were protected from the DIA by Pentagon top brass. Now, Ray McGovern, the former CIA operative, said, well, you have to understand that intelligence is about, well, oftentimes there's an international kind of cooperative arrangement where if I'm not able to do an operation in my own country, I will ask other intelligence operatives to do the operation. And that's what 9/11 really was. It's not quite as cut and dry as Bush knew, but I do believe Cheney and Rumsfeld had a big part in this. It was definitely an international arrangement, and it was definitely headed up by the darker elements of the rabid right wing of our country's political power structure. In my book, Big Wedding, I go back and I dig deep and I find all the Iran-Contra people that should have been convicted and sentenced. Well, half of them are actually now in the Bush administration. I go back and I look at the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the international powerful bank that was originally a third world empowerment bank, and then over time it got taken over by CIA. It was dealing in international arms deals and narcotics and heroin, and but it was a CIA vehicle. It was a vehicle that the CIA used more and more to create a relationship with radical Islam, to overthrow the socialist government of Afghanistan and create the Afghanistan Civil War. The same kind of international power structures, the same kind of power struggle is really what's at the heart of the modern world and at the heart of the 9/11 tragedy. We're talking here about a multi-trillion-dollar deal in oil. And the deal involves the Saudis and Pakistani intelligence, but really the people that benefited and the people that were most interested in that deal were, again, the hard right wing of our political power structure, namely the Bush family, the ascendant neoconservative hawks, especially Cheney and Rumsfeld. In the Big Wedding, I talk about how Cheney and Rumsfeld were on the scene all throughout the mid-'70s, to the right of Nixon, to the right of détente, denouncing SALT II, denouncing the CIA for being too weak, and because they wanted to create their own mythos. In the 70s, Cheney and Rumsfeld created this thing called the Committee on the Present Danger, and they created this thing called Team B, and all dedicated to trying to preempt the CIA and manipulate the media and create this understanding that the Soviet Union was not in decline. The Soviet Union was building up their military. I mean, it was completely false, and the CIA was aghast that the Republicans would put up these think tanks and create these groups just to steer public opinion towards more defense spending. But that's essentially what happened. And in the same way, it's these same right-wingers who created the Project for the New American Century, which grew out of a disdain for the first Bush presidency's lack of interest in invading Iraq with a ground war. They actually said that that in the first Gulf War we should have gone all the way to Baghdad and we should have had troops on the ground. We know now that actually the first President Bush was relatively a lot smarter than his son, in terms of strategy, in terms of avoiding a quagmire. It's not often that I praise the first President Bush here, so don't think this is an endorsement. Yeah. So that let's take a look. I'm sure some of you know this already, but it's worth noting that in year 2000, the same neoconservatives create a statement with their Project for the New American Century group that says we need more control over Central Asia, we need more military bases, we need more military spending, we need total control over the internet, and we need weapons in space. However, in a multicultural society, in the post-Vietnam War generation, we know that the American people are not going to rubber stamp these wars for dominance, for full spectrum dominance. Therefore, and this is a direct quote, we need a catalyzing and catastrophic event on the scale of a new Pearl Harbor. So, going to skip talking about what you already know. You already know that Bush and Cheney have brought in a new standard that's trying to make torture basic policy. Permanent detentions at Guantanamo. They've trashed habeas corpus. In New York City, we know that they've trashed our protection against unreasonable search and seizure. In our city, they can now search anybody's bag at any time, and it's a clear violation of the Bill of Rights. And I know a lot of you know that. However, what really works on a speaking tour is when at this point I hold up this book, and I say that there's this guy up in Portland, the Portland area, named Professor Jules Boykoff. And he's written a book just out now from my friends down in Oakland at AK Press. And it's an amazing book. It's almost like the Boy Scout manual for the FBI, for FBI tactics. And if you own a copy of this as an activist, you're a couple of steps ahead because you know what tactics the FBI not might use, but has used and continues to use to splinter active, living, vibrant movements for dissent and peace and truth. Because, as William Pepper, author of Active State, has said to the 9/11 Truth Movement, you are already infiltrated. There are already people out there that are looking to absorb information and then start, well, for instance, start rumor mills. One of the best examples of how the FBI goes beyond bullets. It's not just shooting us, although sometimes it is, but they go beyond direct murder, and they use more subtle, nuanced techniques, such as snitch jacketing or bad jacketing, which is when the FBI gets inside an activist group with an informant or just somebody who's on the payroll, who's not even necessarily an FBI agent, but somebody who's already going to meetings maybe. And that person then starts rumors that somebody else is an agent or somebody else is an asset or an informant. Now, in my own experience, speaking personally, I've seen this happen. And, it's kind of in the nature of humanity to be a little bit gossipy sometimes. And the FBI is counting on that. The FBI is counting on the intrigue and the mystery of are they or aren't they? Well, once you own a copy of this and you've read that chapter, which is authoritatively done and well-sourced, you realize that we as activists, we have to be better activists. We have to say, hey, be careful, my friend, the next time we hear a rumor like that, and say, hey, what are your sources? And have you ever heard of bad jacketing or snitch jacketing? This is not theoretical. This is just really great activist stuff. And that's why I'm on my fourth case of this book. I've had to go back to Oakland a couple of times to resupply it because it's a part of the talk here. Because we're not just talking about the facts, we're also talking about what can we do. And if we do, what will they do in retaliation? There's more of us than there are of them. There's more people who care about democracy and peace and the First Amendment, and this country is on the verge of some major, major changes. Nobody has told me on this tour, and it's almost over. I'm in the kind of, the cresting waves of this tour. Nobody has told me you're too out there. Or, even when I start talking about spirituality or spiritual shift, or I talk about revolution, political shift, nobody has said, hey, I didn't really like that part. Everyone was really supportive. I'm feeling like when I say that we're on the verge of a major change in this country, I feel like that's not just motivational. It's not just theoretical. That I see it historically. Even though I was born in '71, I've studied the countercultural shifts with the Beat Generation and the '60s radicals and punk rock, and it feels to me like the will of the people has been going this way, and the rule of the ruling class in their elite, bipartisan consensus on permanent war and torture just seems to be going this way. It's like a thin veneer, and it's just it's unsustainable. They've got no bedrock, and you see this in, again, those national polls that say that there's a growing skepticism of 9/11. In the same way there's a growing skepticism of Bush and Cheney and all their war profiteering in general, without even mentioning 9/11. So, in the same way that when John the Baptist was assassinated in the Bible, Well, Jesus actually knew this trick. He probably learned it in Egypt, is that you stand with the legacy of somebody. So when there was that confusion about, who do the people say I am, and some people say you're Elijah, some people say you're John the Baptist, this is evidence that Jesus actually was doing this thing of like standing with the legacy of his hero, his cousin, his beloved fellow prophet. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us. Every time they kill one of us, like Judy Berry of Earth First, like Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News, like Jim Hatfield, the biographer of Bush who took his own life after the system destroyed him in the same way that the system destroyed Gary Webb. Instead of becoming fearful, instead of saying like, well, if they did it to them, they could do it to us, I feel there's actually something magical about being able to stand in the steps of those fellow activists. And there's something, it's a way to actually find new life and find almost a resurrection inside of this oppressive death. Let me tell you about Brooklyn. In the wake of 9/11, there were so many cultural changes that I saw coming through. Legalistically, it was an all-out assault on the basic Bill of Rights and civil liberties. But culturally, there seemed to be a really strange shift going on. All these T-shirts pushing bin Laden as the scapegoat, all these flags, everyone had a flag, and they didn't really seem to have an appreciation of the First Amendment when they were flying that flag. At least that's where I was at in Long Island. In Long Island, you had drunken old white men trying to run down Arabic women in the parking lot of the malls, and that seemed to be a new low for me. And that with all the the Fox News on cable and Fox News was really kind of like seemed to be kind of in their new heyday, and so I thought, well, let's see. I'm a media activist, but I've always liked to do events, and so I kind of started thinking about a new company, and I started this new company called Vox Pop, and it's a fair trade coffee house in the heart of Brooklyn. And I started it not just to sell coffee, but I started it because I felt that there's a need, a universal need for a community, for cross-pollination, for people to come together and get out of the alienation, get out of the kind of the box mentality of being told who to fear, who to hate, and who to blame. And this is a part of my theory or praxis that there is a gigantic mass movement in this country. It's across the political spectrum. It's progressives and patriots who stand together and don't like what's going on with the bipartisan consensus on permanent war and torture and cover-up, really. Because it's not just about Bush and Cheney, it's Bush, Cheney, and Clinton. And a lot of stuff happened in that timeline I talked about the federal protection that happened in the Clinton administration. And it's Clinton who was confronted in Denver by my friend Adam. Clinton who said, 9/11 was not an inside job. 9/11 was an Osama bin Laden job. But let's go off on a tangent for a second, and let me remind you that the FBI's own Rex Toombs, who was a publicist for the FBI, told my friend Ed Haas of the Muckraker Report, very good, that why is Osama bin Laden on the most wanted list, Rex, but he's not cited, he's not indicted for the 9/11 attacks on that list. And Rex Toombs said, well, we just don't have enough evidence to link him to the 9/11 attacks. So then why then would ex-President Clinton say that? Well, he's just like Giuliani. He's trafficking on a non-credible official story. So what are we going to do about it? Part of my message is that 9/11 truth is not a separate movement from the peace movement, that it's all part of a mass movement for peace, for the reassertion of democracy, and that's what Vox Pop is all about. This is my revolution of everyday life. Not every part of running a business for me, even if it is a lefty progressive business, not every part of it is fun, but on a daily basis, I know that I'm committed to change. One of the things that we do is we run this community newspaper that Jules mentioned, and it's called, here it is, it's called New York Megaphone, and this has been a great way to combine the coffee house and the community and the live events with some citizen media activism. And unlike Gary Webb or Jim Hatfield, when their publishers turned on them and betrayed them, when they lost the ability to produce, when they lost the ability to make books and feed their families, that's when their egos, were completely crushed, and I believe both those guys committed suicide, although it's not, 100% certain, but that's what really looks like it happened. They lost their ability to publish and to be writers. But if you have your own publishing vehicle, if you have your own productive enterprise, kind of like what Virginia Woolf says in Room of One's Own, if you have your own economic, self-sustaining entity, then they can't shut you down. It's not up to any one editor in New York or any one producer in Hollywood. And that's what Vox Pop is all about. And I've been meeting people who are interested in doing a Vox Pop in their town. And so if you're interested in that, I've got some information in the back, and you just had to ask for it, and it's free. I made it at Kinko's today. Let me think if there's anything else. Part of the new hope that I have for the world is this new model, the We Are Change model. And I think it's worth talking about right now, even if some of you are familiar with it. But We Are Change is this new subset of the 9/11 truth movement. And I think when the Marxist anthropologists of 200 years from now look back on this time, they will look at the forces of production. They will look at shifts in the technology of the time, and they'll realize that having a lot of cheap video cameras in the hands of a lot of people and having a democratic platform like Google Video or YouTube is a pretty potent mix, because look what the people have done with it, with their own creativity. They've turned on the cameras and gotten in the faces of politicians like Mitt Romney, Bill Clinton, Rudy Giuliani, and asked certain questions. Now, I think this is unprecedented. Even in the late 60s, you had the underground newspaper movement, but you didn't have quite as much access. You didn't have quite as much of a democratic, small d, alternative in terms of, because I think one of the things that's one of the factors here is that when you turn on a camera, you are the media. Because the politicians, it's not in their interest to throw a palm on the lens and say, get that thing out of my face. No, it's actually, when you stand in front of that camera and ask a politician a question with a mic, especially if that question is succinct and to the point, then you become a reporter. That's the kind of thing that we're doing with the New York Megaphone. The Megaphone started because we had these little activist groups that are just spontaneously starting inside of Vox Pop. And to the writers activist group, I said, it's actually very cheap to produce a newspaper. We've done it before. There's some people here from Harrisonburg, Virginia, that from 15 years ago. We did it in Harrisonburg, Virginia during the first Gulf War. And so the We Are Change model of this direct action people's video is, I think it has incredible potential, and it's shown incredible potential. Speaking personally, I did it with Rudy Giuliani recently in Loveland, Colorado, and the results were great. Just by virtue of the fact that we had cameras going, as the media reported on the confrontation and the false arrest from the police, and I got a little bit roughed up, but so they reported on that, but then we got to tell our story in a more unedited form, and that itself was picked up by Raw Story, and so the kind of a pretty big lefty internet site also picked it up, and it became a great story. All right, well, let's do another moment of silence, shall we? This time, we're at the end of the talk, but we're at the beginning of the Q&A period, at the beginning of the discussion period. Anything that I haven't made clear could be made clearer, but I just want to bring it back down. I would like to note that Dr. David Graham is with us here, that Gary Webb is with us here, Judy Berry is with us here, Jim Hatfield is with us, and all the different people who have stood for truth and fighting the power. That even if you fall at the hands of the state, you're not forgotten. In fact, you've made us stronger. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I can take some questions if anybody has any questions. Or I can tell you about the fabulous book deal that we offer, or I offer as part of the tour. But I'll get to that in a minute. You had a question.
Yeah, how did the FBI know that Graham was going to publish a book?
Okay, good question. How did the FBI know that Graham was going to publish his book? You know what? He was in pretty close contact with them. In fact, when he died, the fact that he was a volunteer citizen informant, really should have warranted some sort of investigation into his death. I have a feeling, to answer your question, I have a feeling he told them. I have a feeling and you could probably find a better answer if you actually download the book, because it never made print, never got printed, but it is a free download at sanderhicks.com. So. And I don't remember the last details in the book, but he probably was trying to leverage the threat of publication. You should treat me more seriously. You should stop, treating me so hostilely. If I could sort of speak for Graham, he probably was very open with them. He was open to a fault, and because I'll tell you this, I interviewed an FBI guy. I went down there to Shreveport and completely lucked into a face-to-face with one of the agents who Graham had been working with. And this agent knew exactly who I was talking about. And he effectively admitted that the FBI did discredit him. I said, why did the FBI tell these doctors that he was suicidal? And the FBI guy was like, oh, well, Dr. Graham lived in an apartment above his office. Dr. Graham had to be reminded to lock up his office at night. Did you talk to the receptionist who had to remind him? It's kind of like, what? I just asked you about these allegations of suicide, and you're talking around that, and you're giving me something that's not related. It was very weird. I said, hey, was Muhammad Jamal Khan an informant? He said, we don't discuss informants, but no. I said, I'll take that as a yes. He said, you can take that any way you want to. And then we went back and forth on a number of things, but it ended with him saying to his receptionist, call security. Like, call security? You guys are secure. You guys are the mother flipping FBI. You guys are the top police organization. According to Professor Boykoff, you guys are some of the top assassins against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement. You guys, you don't need to call the golf cart security guard down in the parking lot, brother. You're the FBI. Why are you so scared of me? This guy literally, he had such physical repression. He had like a tick in his eye and stuff, and you could tell he had like a lot of guilt in his heart. I can't prosecute based on the guilt in his heart, but I'm not a lawyer. I can't prosecute Jack, but in the court of public opinion, I would submit to you, the jury, that this guy had a lot he was holding back. And, according to the 9/11 Graham report, which you can read, you can see how many times Steve Hayes, FBI special agent, met with Graham. So, and at one point Hayes asked me, he said at one point, I've read some of the book, but I haven't read all of the book. And I said, why didn't you read the entire book? This guy was trying to be a good citizen, a good informant to you. And Hayes said, well, did he ever get the book published? And I said, God damn it. I didn't say God damn it, but I said, and I shouldn't say that thing in a Quaker meeting hall, but anyway, it's the Catholic part of me coming out, can you see? But I did say, Steve Hayes, Graham was about to publish the book on the verge of his poisoning. You know, don't tell me that just because he didn't get the book published by Harper and Row that you're not going to then, you know, treat it credibly, because you should treat it credibly. You're in it, you know. So yeah. So that gives you probably a better sense of the relationship Graham had between FBI, right? Good. Question back there?
Yes, Andrew. Two things, real quick. You wrote the book, The Big Wedding, dealing with Randy Glass, Frieden, and all of that. You spent a lot of energy in that book, ending up pretty much with the LIHOP position. I wonder if you could illuminate us in terms of where you went since you've written that book and where you are now. And the second thing is I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the National Review and Stanford University have demonized you.
Sure. Okay, great. For anybody that doesn't know the terminology the gentleman used, LIHOP is a school of thought inside the 9/11 truth movement that's a little bit more conservative than some. But LIHOP stands for Let It Happen on Purpose. And you come from the perspective of the Bush administration. They are corrupt, but they're not so corrupt that they would, you know, orchestrate 9/11 and protect these guys. They probably just knew about it through inevitable CIA informants that we know we have, but they probably just let it happen on purpose because they needed it to justify, you know, the PNAC, Project for the New American Century imperative for New Pearl Harbor, right? And I personally have always argued that ethically it's just the same thing as the other school of thought, which is make it happen on purpose. Because if you let a murder happen, or 3,000, it's the same thing morally as making 3,000 murders happen, right? So it's sort of an academic debate. And also people who read Big Wedding, they say, you know what? Some people call him a lie hopper, but really he's a my hopper, because it's really hard to read some of this stuff in the book and not come off with they made it happen on purpose because of all the anomalies. However, you're right in the sense that I did sort of try to package my book with like the back cover. Originally, when I published it a couple of years ago, you know, I was trying to take, you know, somewhat of a careful approach so that maybe I could get back on 60 Minutes, you know, since I was just there with Fortunate Son and the Bush biography, but that was not to be. I was foolish for doing it. So the thing that's most lie-hop about my book is the headline on the back cover, which says, "Did the Bush White House allow 9/11 to happen?" Which up to the point of publication was something a little bit more controversial and provocative, like the Bush administration made 9/11 happen. But that's certainly my perspective now, because I have developed as an activist. And not only am I discarding conservative advertising copy on the back cover of my book, but I'm emphasizing the pattern of U.S. federal protection, which is itself the most authoritative way to do the MyHop argument. You know, saying Bush knew or sloganeering around some sort of speculative conspiracy theory isn't as compelling. It doesn't build a movement as much as hard historical fact with your dates and your cities and your places and as many names as you can possibly cram into your head. So that's what I've done. And then, you know, I happened to do a piece for Alternet about 9/11 Truth, which was an incredible miracle in itself that I got that one through. And that was a catalyst that got somebody to send me the Dr. Graham stuff. So it's like 2007 was a huge year for me, and like one door led to another. And, you know, the Dr. Graham death itself is a clear case of MyHop. Not because, you know, if you isolate it, and if you read Dr. Graham's book himself, he was isolated. He wasn't speaking to any peace activists, because there are none in Shreveport, at least when I was there. And he wasn't speaking to 9/11 Truth people, and he wasn't really a 9/11 Truth guy. But his evidence is so compelling for the MyHop argument, you know, especially when you talk about that little anecdote I just talked about. Was Muhammad Jamal Khan an informant? Well, we don't talk about informants. I mean, no. You know, that's clear that Muhammad Jamal Khan was an informant. In the videotapes that you can see online now, Muhammad Jamal Khan brags about polygamy. He got married in Texas to stay in the country, Dr. Graham's like, weren't you married in Pakistan? And so suddenly Khan is giving Graham his high five. He's nervous. He's laughing. He's saying, oh, yes, they tried to convict me of that one, but I have friends, my ambassador back in Washington, political friends. So obviously Khan is a very, very connected to Washington, D.C. kind of FBI informant in this case. Perfect case of MyHop. Also, one last tangent, because it's such a great question. And then I'll ask you what the second part of your question was. I have one copy of Webster Tarpley's book here, which is really upgraded my own knowledge with his broad historical inquiry. I mean, I know the guy's problematic. He's got, he used to be with Lyndon LaRouche like 20 years ago, but he broke with them, so a lot of people don't like him because of that. But if you can forgive him his past political sins and read a 500-page, authoritative, historically rooted take, not just on 9/11, but a pattern, going back to NATO, going back to 1846, James K. Polk in the Mexican-American War, a pattern of false flag terror, false attacks, media spectacles being used to motivate the population. 9/11 was not an isolated case. What was the second part of your question?
You've been demonized by National Review
Oh, yeah.
at Stanford University.
Right. As deranged.
Just recently, yeah.
Deranged. Am I deranged? That's why because I was with the professor today, that's why I wore a jacket and a tie, because the esteemed professor was going to be here. So anyway, yeah, I don't always wear a jacket and a tie, but when you get called deranged, you sort of they raise the ante. But it's interesting that they attacked my character but didn't attack the argument. I'd really like somebody to take on the argument. In the case of a criminal trial, habeas corpus, we have a body in this case. There's nothing more compelling. In the same case in rock and roll, if somebody dies young, they become a hero. It's the same case in history. If somebody dies unjustly, they should become a martyr. Because martyrs are ways for the people to get motivated and to kind of to look to our saints. Now, Dr. Graham was not a political saint, but he was, a fellow truth seeker, a fellow independent journalist. So anyway, I'd love to see the National Review take me on in a debate. I have started to debate neoconservatives. My girlfriend Jill was there when and we were always quoting this to each other. The young neoconservative lady started her argument by saying, very similar to the National Review's take, she started her argument by saying, well, I haven't written a book about this stuff, and I just don't care as much about this stuff, and I don't have as much time to research this stuff as my opponent because I have a life and a job and a car. So it's the car argument. In the same case, in the same way, the National Review online said this guy is speaking at Stanford Law, ostensibly on civil liberties, and I was speaking on civil liberties, and I did actually tailor the speech you heard with more civil liberties information and anecdotes. Well, they dismissed that. They said ostensibly it's about civil liberties, but really Hicks is a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and we just know that's what he'll mention. And unfortunately, though, at the same time, something that had a little bit more of an effect is that somebody in the student body at Stanford, I don't know if he was in the law school or not, but he found a way to hack into a listserv that spammed the entire campus, and he denounced me and he told people not to go. And I mean, we had a room that was like a lecture hall, and we had a room for 60 people, and we thought professors were going to come. Now, I don't know if this guy had an effect or not. I mean, I know the kind of progressive I am. If like some right-wing hack, suddenly spammed me, I wouldn't have that dissuade me. But people that are more on the fence about an issue, thinking like, oh, are people going to call me crazy if I start, becoming like a 9/11 free DVD guy, and or, I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that are thinking like, gosh, what do I do? Do I take a stand? Do I not? Well, in this case, it might have had an effect because this guy spammed the entire campus and then was like banned from these listservs, and he told people not to go, and I think he contacted National Review. And it might have had a bit of a chilling effect because there wasn't a packed house of 60 people in the lecture hall that we were expecting. It was like 20 students or so. 10 of them had their laptops up during the entire talk, and they just were down on their laptops taking notes and stuff. I felt like, hey, is this on? I felt like saying I felt like being like a badass teacher and being like, laptops down, laptops. How do you handle it? Do you let people play Dungeons and Dragons or whatever the fuck they're doing. Some of them were taking notes. That's what somebody said. But if they take notes, you sometimes make eye contact with the prof, right? So I don't know. But anyway, that was Stanford. It was not half as lively an audience as you, and half as receptive and nice an audience as you. But then I got on Stanford Radio right afterwards and did a whole hour-long thing with them, and that was cool too. So, and a lot of people think it was like some of the best press of the entire tour, and they're right because it was the only press of the entire tour. But they really summarized. They took a soundbite, a quote from a video I have on YouTube of me talking to Book Look TV, and they summarized some of the historical stuff in Big Wedding. They summarized the Pakistani ISI, Soviet, Afghan Civil War, CIA links. They sort of summarized that, and they did have some of that in their article. So it was an attack piece, but it did get the argument out there in distorted form.
The book, basically, you characterize LIHOP, but I think your book gives a lot more substance to creating that patsy thing. I mean, there's a huge amount of energy by these hacks that went into that. And I think that's what so it isn't just a passive, well, we allowed this to happen. It was really very, very concentrated, heavy-duty amount of energy, BCCI and ISI and everything that you put in there. So, anyway.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. All right, let's go here and then there.
The Graham family, did they look at him as a martyr or
not? Good question, the Graham family. I was almost going to go off on a tangent and talk about them earlier when I first brought them up, but they are what we don't want to become because they're like 1930s Germany. They're literally saying it happened to him, and if we speak out, it'll probably happen to us. And I don't want to judge them too much because they lost somebody only a year ago from last September 2006. Because they went through this 27-month ordeal of organ failure and paralysis with him. He was given a less than 1% chance to live in the hospital in 2004, but then he came back. It was like a miracle, and he regained his level of speech. And when the family was in the hospital room, he never talked about who he thought did this to him. But when people from Shreveport Community Church who were more politically curious, or his dental hygienist came back to visit him in the hospital and said, "Who did this to you?" He said, at one point he said, "I don't know, maybe the FBI." And to Leanne Scruggs, the dental hygienist, he said, it was the FBI. Not Muhammad Jamal Khan, not the only other person you could have suspected. He didn't suspect him at all. Muhammad Jamal Khan was a federal fugitive at that point, and he was, looks like he was somehow able to evade authorities and get back to Pakistan, because that's where we think he is now. So the Graham family was not helpful. They wouldn't talk to us on the record. I came down there with a reporter who did a big story for North Carolina Alt Weekly, 5,000-word story. You can get it off sanderhicks.com. So the family were not helpful. Yes, sir.
Yeah, who was tracking Muhammad Atta? Because I know he was
Daniel Hopsiker.
He was pretty well. I met Daniel. Atta was pretty well known in Venice, Florida. In fact, one time in June 2001, my ex-wife and I saw him and his sidekick Marwan drinking it up at Sharky's.
No way! I've been to Sharky's.
You've been to Sharky's?
Yeah, I've been to Sharky's with Daniel Hopsiker.
Oh, really?
That's amazing. You saw Atta, huh?
Yeah, we were sitting there, we were at the bar, the Horseshoe Bar with the margarita machine and stuff.
I've been there.
And my wife said, "Look at those two guys over there." And we looked around, here these two fellows, they really looked out of place, because, Sharky's is kind of a Jimmy Buffett type place. Like
Yes.
Jimmy Buffett used to come in sometimes and just start singing,
Right.
So there's these two guys, and one of them was just glaring.
Yeah.
That was Atta.
It's a great question.
Marwan was kind of talking with some people at the table
Right.
nearby. So.
Yeah, and I build on Daniel Hopsiker's research in my book, Big Wedding, because Hopsiker is the guy that found Muhammad Atta's American girlfriend, Amanda Keller, who had been a pink-haired stripper, before she found Jesus, she, it's a classic American story. She needed to have a rebound relationship, so she actually picked Muhammad Atta to have a rebound relationship with, and but got close to him and had this level of detail that's totally at odds with a radical Islamic fundamentalist story. You know, he loved pork chops, he loved lap dances, he loved cocaine. He had friends from Germany who would fly in, like Wolfgang Boehringer, who would fly in and take him out drinking at Hooters. They would get drunk and get kicked out of Hooters together. It's funny, Wolfgang Boehringer, I mean, this is some of the new stuff that I found recently. Wolfgang Boehringer was recently apprehended by the Joint Terrorism Task Force. They wanted to talk to him. And he said, "You can't arrest me. I'm with the CIA." And he was released within about 24 hours. This is just like about last year.
Flying schools.
Yeah.
Two different flying schools.
Two Dutch guys, right? Two
different
flying
Dutch
schools,
guys,
right? Both of whom had mysterious small aircraft crashes in the couple of years after 9/11. I talked to one of those guys too, Arnie Krutov. He's still in business down there in Florida. In my book, I go back and I find out that that flight school in Venice actually has a long history of working with DEA and CIA and U.S. military. It's actually a former U.S. military airstrip. It used to be 57th Airborne or something like that. So before I forget, before people leave, I don't want anybody to leave without knowing about this fabulous deal in books that we're doing here tonight. Because, and we'll take more questions and comments and stuff in just a second, but I got to put it in the product pitch here before anybody leaves. All right, so in stores, this is 14, but you're talking to the publisher, so we can make a deal on this, all right? And I don't want you to leave the house ever again without your copy of Jules Boykoff, and he'll sign it for you, your copy of Beyond Bullets, The Suppression of Dissent in the United States. And for those of you who might have missed the pitch the first time around, this is like the Boy Scout handbook of what the FBI is doing to you. This is the tactics that the FBI has in their arsenal to use media manipulation, to do rumor mongering, and basically to target activist groups and systematically break them apart. So what I've been doing is, it's called the 4 for 40 deal. You can get my book and Professor Boykoff's book and a free extra copy of my book, and plus anything else on my table. And I've got like a whole wide selection of anarchist and left history books, just selected from the AK Press warehouse, and it's my editor's, kind of discerning selection, a fine array of really cool, like hobo novelettes and graphic novels about militarism and all that stuff. And that's the 4 for 40 deal. And so you get 4 books for $40. It's cheaper than Powell's. You don't usually pay $10 a book at Powell's, right? And of course, if you want just one of these books, Professor Boykoff's book is $21.95. Mine is negotiable. And there's free catalogs from AK Press back there, and there's DVDs back there. And so at the end of the Q&A, we will have a frenzy of information dissemination.
Sandra, we have one more author who
Oh,
will
yeah.
books at your table. We have Paul Levy, who is local, and Paul, he has his books back at Sanders table also.
Great. How much are they?
$15.95. but
$15.95?
they're totally negotiable too.
Okay, great. So you want to be part of the 4 for 40 deal?
Sure.
All right, great. So he's part of the deal. So if you want Paul Levy's book, local author.
What's the name? What's the name of the book?
The Madness of George W. Bush, a reflection of our collective psychosis.
Oh, great. Pass it around. Pass it around. Paul will pass around his book so you can see it. This is good. Excellent. Yeah, the Mossad was tracking them and getting too close, and it's the CIA and FBI that busted them and deported them from preventing any interference in August of 2001. Yes, sir.
Question. First of all, thank you for coming to Portland.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, I'm a firm believer. I mean, hearing the facts and et cetera, that 911 was the inside job. I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, to most people. Though it was, I kind of had a feeling about it. Hadn't really studied it, till a few months ago. But anyway, my question is this: having a firmer picture on the situation now between the war and 911, you mentioned earlier that these 911 groups, which in my synopsis would seem like a catalyst to put together the, like you said, the war, the whole hypocrisy, and maybe be a catalyst to, you know, inspire change. Why, in your opinion, why hasn't there been one major 911 group? Has it been infiltration from the FBI? I mean, why wouldn't there be, you know, like impeachment group is impeachbush.com, whatever's got 1 million people, the most people. Different movements. In your opinion,
Yeah.
what has happened? Have they just divided and conquered that too, or?
No, I can't say for certain. I realize personally that there's an opportunity to be even more of a 9/11 activist. You know, if I wasn't running a coffee house in Brooklyn that was a part of the movement, I think I'd be more of an administrator to the movement. You know, I personally think that, you know, you make choices, you can't do everything. And so I personally don't have a lot of first-hand experience with the actual structure of the organization. I'm pretty happy that it's pretty decentralized right now and pretty effective. In terms of actual political changes, though, well, there are a couple of avenues open to us. In New York, we're doing a ballot initiative. This guy, William Pepper, the author of Active State, he's the guy that was friends with Martin Luther King, and he wrote this awesome book on the King assassination and exposing that. Well, he's now head of the New York City ballot initiative to try to get a people's movement for an independent investigation onto the ballot so that we can vote on it, and then that'll be a way that we can use the apparatuses of the courts and government to get an independent investigation to move truth forward. I would also say check out the Green Party if you haven't already, because the Green Party is a party that's committed to nonviolence and truth, and there's a lot of 9/11 truth people inside the Green Party. I personally am a proud Green. I have a lot of hope because we have a politics star on our hands here. You know, not a rock star, but Cynthia McKinney is probably going to be the big candidate in the Green Party this year. And and I'm excited because she has already demonstrated a keen interest in 9/11 truth, but also the Martin Luther King assassination truth, and Katrina, you know, really exploring WTF happened in New Orleans with Katrina. And so I don't know if the 9/11 truth movement needs to be its own political party, per se. I know that's not really what you were asking, but to me I hear like a need, you're saying a need for more political structure, maybe? Is that what I'm hearing?
I wouldn't go for as far as political. I mean, as far as grassroots goes, I mean, putting something together large enough, like Giuliani used that for his campaign. Why haven't the activists used that more? I mean, we have. I know that. I could see that, and I would have to think, like you said, the numbers are higher than the 30%. I think more than 30% of the people think something's at least fishy.
Yeah, let me show you. Yeah, but however, if 9/11 truth is only an issue that 40% of the population have skepticism, as a political candidate, you don't necessarily want to run on that. And I know this personally, being a former Green Party political candidate. Even with a progressive Democrat, Mike Kopis, who's running in San Diego right now, he actually kicked off the tour with me with a really cool house party. It was a gathering a lot like this. A lot of committed progressives, Greens, and progressive Democrats were in the room. And I saw a piece of his campaign literature, and this is a guy that's a major 9/11 truth activist. He's been a source for me on my big Silverstein Spitzer story. And Kopis didn't even mention 9/11 in his campaign literature. If you knew him, you knew that he was a 9/11 truther. But politics is like, I hate to say it, but you got to be really careful when you're running a campaign, and you've got to run on issues that have broader support, like peace and withdrawal. That's an issue that does have majority support. 9/11 truth, you know, the MyHop school of thought does not have 80% support. It has a growing, very interesting section of support that is probably around 30 or 40 or 45%. But a good political strategist is not going to run a candidate on 9/11. I hate to sound like a Clintonite or a politically pragmatic centrist, but it's just that you got to run on issues that you're stronger on. And at this point, 9/11 is probably not an issue that could win a congressional seat. But what are your thoughts?
are that I'm asking all of you to think positively about impeachment, because part of the impeachment is about anything that we have any close to democracy in this country are our constitutional rights, that they have been completely obliterated very publicly. And as long as that lie continues, as long as that elephant is in the living room, it gives everyone permission to choose what they want to talk about. In other words, the whole umbrella is a lie. So I just am asking you, I know we've all been sort of brainwashed. We will impeach them. We're going to impeach them. A lot's going on here in Portland and nationally. The log jams are beginning to break up. I'm going to Washington in a week and a half. Barbara Ellis, some of you know her, has put together an incredible thing, a plan that we're sharing, and we're getting good response. I'm just asking for all of your good wishes for the very reason you were talking about, which is there's a spiritual movement here of truth. Yeah. And we all have to think about it in a positive way. Forget the details. Just know that it's the right thing. And when that happens, a lot of these things that they've been able to avoid because they're avoiding that elephant are going to be will be given permission to talk about. So that's to me the reason. So I'm asking, please, on the 26th and 27th, push all your good energy for impeachment to Washington, D.C. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
All right.
Pelosi says she's not going to let that happen.
Well, that's her problem.
Yeah. Right. I also was given free impeach the president stickers too. They're red, white, and blue, and an artist in Venice, California gave them to me early on in the tour. And I have a couple of them left. And yeah, so right on. Thank you for that. It's actually more interesting and good to just run, because you'll learn so much more about the political system. You know, I ran for governor, and then it shifted, and they wanted me to run for Senate, and I learned a lot from that. I learned that it'd probably be better to run for city council or something that's more grassroots, first of all. But I also learned a lot about election law and also from the party perspective, campaigns are great opportunities to get issues out. You know, the right to life people learned this by just getting the right to life thing on a lot of different ballots. Just that, you know, the issue, you saw it on the ballot line. Or the marijuana reform people had the same thing. The ballot line, you know, if you have a ballot line, then you're you know, people are like, oh, what's the marijuana reform party or whatever. So yeah, even in the ISO, the socialist group says the same thing, that it's you know, they're not one of these lefty groups that turns their nose up at elections, you know, and then in year 2000 they were supporting Nader, and they said that even if maybe we're not running to win, maybe we're running to get the issue out there and get more visibility and more voices involved in our movement, and I think it's a sound strategy. Anybody else that hasn't spoken, or yeah?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned YouTube earlier. This is for my YouTube channel. Okay, so I have a hypothetical for you. Say someone that's never heard of 9/11 Truth or never heard of the 9/11 Truth movement, they were skeptical of the official narrative of the 9/11 terrorism attacks. What sources of information would you point them out? What books would you tell them to read? What Google searches would you suggest to them? Aside from your book, of course.
Right, I know. That's a good question. For me, personally, I was really inspired when I first saw one of Barry Zwicker's videos about the military stand down. And I don't know if that's even still out there, so it might not even be a great answer, but he's a Canadian, and he talked about the clear anomalies with, you know, fighter jets not being scrambled on that day. I'd like to ask people, you know, if you're so certain of the official story, well, where's Osama? You know, why do CIA people in Pakistan say that he was deliberately let go? You know, do you know about Fahrenheit 9/11? Do you know about Osama's past with the CIA? Is that not relevant to the discussion at all? Yeah. In terms of controlled demolition, I've actually personally turned people on to the the videos of World Trade Center 7 collapsing, and that has been a pretty instantaneous question mark for people. You know, it's not the end of the argument, but it could be the beginning. Especially, even like this guy, I actually know one of the architects of World Trade Centers 1 and 2, Fred Gutnick. He hangs around Vox Pop in Brooklyn, and he was a skeptic and he was very anti these crazy theories that say that the towers were brought down with explosives. But then I showed him the video of World Trade Center 7, and he's still anti-controlled demolition about 1 and 2, but about 7, he admits that that video is just too clear. The crimp and the explosion of the penthouse first, and then the crimp and the collapse. So now still there's people in the 9/11 Truth movement, like in Eugene, one of the smarter people I know in 9/11 Truth is very much anti-controlled demolition. So take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, I think online I endorse the 9/11 Terror Timeline, the Cooperative Research, Paul Thompson. He's done some very interesting work using only mainstream media sources. Some of them lesser known, international, mainstream media sources, but mainstream sources. And like I did, just lays out the timeline, like Malaysia 2000, yada, yada, yada. And I used him quite a bit in my book, Big Wedding. So Loose Change is getting better and better each time they remake that film. I'm biased because I'm in the final cut, but but that's what was interesting about that film. Even Loose Change too, which some of the more orthodox, historical 9/11 people, they were denouncing the film. They thought it was shoddy. But I was like, well, you know what? This film is like it's made by like 21-year-olds who have a lot of heart and a lot of curiosity, and they get something that you don't get with your 600-page books. They get that people love pacing and music in film. The MTV generation made their 9/11 film. And for me, it worked because it wasn't perfect, but I'm not asking for perfection. All I'm asking is for something to be well made on its own terms, and this thing was well made. And obviously, 50 million downloads aren't wrong. So, yeah.
Maybe somebody should give them a copy of Edward Bernays' propaganda. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Use their own weapons against them.
Yeah. Right. Good. All right. Yes, sir.
So what about the fellow that's down in Guantanamo that says, I planned it all?
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has been tortured into mental jelly. Yeah. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he also told a Al Jazeera reporter, Youssef Foudra, that the big confession for that guy you mentioned, KSM, was in Foudra's book, Masterminds of Terror. But it was really strange. At the time, Foudra goes through all of this this drama of like, I found him in Pakistan and I tracked him down. And Foudra probably also informed on his whereabouts to the Pakistani ISI after the fact and the CIA after the fact. But it's a really strange book. You should look at it because, this is the big scapegoat, the big mastermind of terror. But in this big, confession, in this scene, KSM confesses in this really weird offhand manner. He just says, yeah, we did it. And now we know he's been tortured, and now we know that has an effect on the brain. So it's almost like whatever he says right now in his military tribunal, his fake trial, whatever he says is to me, as judge, inadmissible in my court of my opinion, because the guy's been excessively tortured, and he'll say anything at this point. However, it is interesting to go back and look at our long-standing relationship with these guys, even in the '93 World Trade Center bombing. So another way to kind of say that nothing is what it seems is even in New York City in 1993, the names are the same, the faces are the same. Ramzi Youssef was involved in that, and he's also he's the guy that's now in Supermax prison in Colorado. And he is actually the nephew of the guy you mentioned, KSM, on trial right now in the military tribunal in Guantanamo. And '93 was, again, a highly infiltrated, terrorist operation. But we had two FBI informants, Imad Salem and Ali Mohammed, who, had that thing penetrated, and they were reporting back. And, we could have stopped the '93 World Trade Center bombing.
The FBI insists that the explosive actually work? Because what I'd read was
Right.
that the organizer of this was an Egyptian major or something like that. And he asked the FBI if he could kind of mix up an explosive that wouldn't work. And the FBI said no. So can you tell us more about that? I was a little bit unclear on that.
Yeah, well, the citation that I have is, I've heard that story, but I haven't found that citation, so I can't speak directly to that. Yeah, the New York Times did do some reporting about this. The stuff I cited was even more damning. Imad Salem was the FBI informant that was one of the FBI informants we're talking about here. And he got paranoid, so he started taping his own phone conversations. He was like, infiltrating and wearing a wire for the FBI. But even when he was talking to the FBI, he started making tapes of his own. So on one of those tapes that he started slipping to journalists after the fact, he's talking to a guy named Antisev at the FBI, and he says stuff like, "Isn't this great? We built the bomb with supervision of the FBI, and nobody says nothing." And it's a really interesting conversation, and there's a transcript in my book, Big Wedding. But what's really interesting is that Antisev doesn't say, "What are you talking about? That's totally untrue. The FBI, you did not build the bomb with supervision of the FBI." The FBI guy just kind of takes that as a fait accompli in the transcript, it seems, and then goes off about how we're doing this for a reason at the end of the transcript. Like, don't worry about it. Don't worry. We know what we're doing. And then, this is really great. If you really know your details here, in the Moussaoui trial, I was probably one of the few people that said, Antisev, why is an FBI agent named Antisev taking the stand in the Moussaoui trial? Wasn't there an Antisev somewhere in my book? And I go to the index and I'm like, Antisev, there he is. He's the guy that's talking to Imad Salem in the aftermath of the 93 World Trade Center bombing. So zoom up like 13 years to the Moussaoui trial. Turns out it's his brother. There's two Antisevs in the FBI, and they both were tasked to work with the same group of people, like Moussaoui. Moussaoui, I almost don't even need to mention to you, was protected by the FBI because the FBI, Colleen Rowley, Time Magazine Woman of the Year, right? She wanted to get the FISA court to rubber stamp, like they always used to, yes, you can investigate this. Yes, you think that this is a foreign intelligence asset, and so the FISA court that's set up to deal with foreign intelligence surveillance will just rubber stamp it like they always do and say yes. But in this case, the answer was no. You can't investigate this Moussaoui character or what's on his laptop in Minnesota. And she was shocked. She was like, she wrote her letter to Director Mueller, she said, I don't want to use words as strong as cover up, but, and then for being the whistleblower, she got Time Magazine Woman of the Year with Sharon Watkins from Enron. And so that's another instance that, I don't always mention, but it's another compelling instance of Moussaoui protected by FBI. So who takes the stand against Moussaoui is Antisev. Somebody should have asked him about his brother and Imad Salem and the other time that FBI people were protected. Terrorists were protected by FBI. Oh, right. I'm sorry, I'm spitting on the lectern. All right. I'm frothing at the mouth. That's a bad sign. Don't print that in the National Review. Of course, it's great to have blogging commentary, because on my blog on GNN, somebody said, well, you've got to remember that there was an operation called Project Mockingbird in which the CIA did create media vehicles. And one of their people was Buckley, the founder of the National Review. So it's kind of interesting that there's been basically a media blackout over this tour. I thought maybe I'd get a few bits of press here and there. But the one bit of press I got was in this vehicle that has been sometimes alleged to be a CIA mouthpiece. And in this case, they certainly are trumpeting the CIA's line, So in the same way, I also am traveling with one of the books in the kind of the grab bag box is a very interesting book called Zenith's Secret, and it's my own original contribution to the JFK and RFK truth movements. And it's written by a guy who had paramilitary experience and worked with CIA in the early 60s and rubbed elbows with CIA personnel who he says that he knows were involved in the RFK and JFK deaths Very interesting book. So, and this is an interesting media anecdote. The editor of the local paper in Wisconsin, where the author lives, contacted the CIA and asked the CIA if this was true. And the CIA, I've never heard of them doing this, but they actually denounced the book, and they denounced me and my marketing strategy in a letter to the editor of the Wisconsin paper, who then slipped it to his neighbor, our author, who then slipped it to me. So now it's on the inside front cover of the book as kind of a I don't know, an imprimatur of authenticity. You know, if the CIA denounces you, then you must be onto something. If the National Review, the CIA mouthpiece, denounces you, I don't know. I'm either deranged or I'm onto something. And I don't believe the speech I gave tonight was in any way deranged. Do you? No. Good. Well, my only deranged problem is that I haven't eaten dinner yet, so I'm probably going to want to segue into signing some books and making you deals. And there's also a special deal. If you buy $50 worth of books, you get a free baby sequoia from the California redwoods. Yeah. You think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. You can walk away with your own baby sequoia. And the caveat is don't plant it within 15 feet of a building. It's like a life bomb. It'll just go up, and in 100 years, your building will be blown away. All right, so final questions or comments from the body politic. You, and then, did you have something else? All right, great. Let's go here, and then the speakers list will be closed. Okay.
Have you heard the rumor JFK Jr. was going to run for the Senate seat now occupied by
Hillary Clinton.
Mrs. Clinton?
I've never heard that before. Yes, no, I have, yes. Yes, the rumor is that JFK Jr. was going to run for Hillary Clinton's seat. And I got people on this. There's a guy in LA actually who's doing a whole novel about it in like fiction form because he's too paranoid of doing it in nonfiction form. And there's lots of anomalies around that case, and those Kennedys have a bad habit of getting whacked by their fellow members of the U.S. ruling class who happen to be more militaristic and pro-war. So yeah. You never heard that before? You have a look of astonishment on your face.
No, I'm wondering, so is he going to, or, I mean,
No, JFK Jr.,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
one who's dead.
uh-huh,
Right. No, he can't run, he's dead.
oh, okay.
We're not talking about RFK Jr.
Oh, okay, you're not
RFK
talking
Jr. is the guy who's on Air America sometimes.
Okay,
But he's got a major narcotics bust on his record, so I don't know if RFK is going to...
okay, that's.
I mean,
fine.
maybe post-Obama, maybe everything's on the table now. I'm thinking maybe RFK's got a shot now, on a legalization platform. Are you with me? Let's do it. All right. Maybe if he can run green, then I'll endorse RFK Jr. Okay, final question or comment.
All right. I noticed that you mentioned a media outlet that was an agent of influence. Could you mention other ones that maybe work for or that are known
The
to
Washington
work for?
Post.
Okay, the Washington
It's
Post.
important to remember that the story of Gary Webb, who I've only just mentioned, but the Washington Post comes up a couple of times. I mean, obviously they do some good reporting sometimes, right? And I'm originally from that area, but it's really interesting to note that when the major media needed to start a campaign of disinformation against Gary Webb, against the whole CIA, Contra, cocaine connection that he was exposing in the 90s in the San Jose Mercury News, it was Walter Pincus of the Washington Post who led the attack, there was follow-on from the LA Times that was just as vicious, and there was a little bit more nuanced follow-on from the New York Times. But that was basically a three-way pile-on that destroyed the man, destroyed his career, got him fired. And it was led by Walter Pincus, who's still actually a reporter. Walter Pincus, it's documented, actually worked for CIA, spying on student groups in 1957. So it's interesting to see the guy with CIA connections that were proven in the past and possible CIA connections that continue to the present was the guy that was the point man for beginning this onslaught, this overheated onslaught. Even the New York Times' own ombudsman said that we were probably a little bit too heated in our attack, but the level of vitriol in that attack ended somebody's life. It's straight up. This guy died because of a massive media onslaught. His own paper betrayed him, his own editors, his own, yeah, right, yeah. It's an American tragedy and it deserves to be told. There's actually a great book called Kill the Messenger that I highly recommend. Well, I don't highly recommend it because of some reasons, but I recommend it. It's a solid book, and it you know, for all the people that engage, and I feel sometimes people are a little bit too quick to assume, people like Gary Webb or Jim Hatfield, they're too quick to assume that something was nefarious about their suicides. But sometimes you got to have a more broader political analysis and realize that the system killed them. The system stripped them of their ability to be who they were, to be writers, to be published writers. And so therefore, the psychological effect ended up with them taking their own lives. But that doesn't mean the system isn't guilty. The system, you see what I'm saying? It's a little bit more nuanced than a straight up CIA assassin. Good, we're done. All right, good. Thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you to Jules for doing this event with me, and Jules will sign your copy of Beyond Bullets, right? Okay. All right, yes, my props.
Nice job.
Hey, thank you.
What? Thank you, everybody, for coming. We have another event coming up next month. Richard Gage, Architects for 9/11 Truth. And we meet every week. We have a sign-up list if you'd like to sign up. And we have a donation if you'd like to help us grow and spread the message. And thank you, everybody, for coming.